Okay, so we're going to get started. I just want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. The timing's a little bit off, but it's good to have something to do in the middle of the day if we're just kind of at home. Well, except for Zeyn, who's, I guess, middle of the night, not night. But Zeyn, we're going to welcome him back to the Fairfield Public Library for what is technically the third time. He very generously came to one of our book groups at one point to talk about the Map of Salt and Stars. If you haven't read The Map of Salt and Stars, it's a beautiful book. Grab a copy. We have plenty of them here. The 30 Names of Night is Zeyn's second book now. He's a member of the Radius of Arab American Writers and American Mensa. He's been an artist in residence at foundations around the world, and he comes to us today from Italy. So thank God for technology. We're just thrilled to have him back. This book has been postponed a couple of times for publication. Finally came out last week, hit the shelves finally. It's a beautiful book. If you can see it, it's behind Zeyn's head and it's here too. At some point, we're going to have you talk about this cover that I discovered you had painted the picture yourself. So we'll get to that too. I'm going to let Zeyn
not
tell
this
you.
cover. But...
No, not that one. But the 30 Names of Night, the bird that's on this cover. This is an imaginary bird, or is this a real something that you?
Well, the cover I think is based on a real. Well, you know what? I don't know. I mean, we should ask the cover designer, Lewan Kwan, but she did an amazing job.
Okay.
I could never make anything so amazing. But yeah, we love it.
Great. All right, so I'm going to let Zeyn take it over at this point to talk about this book, the second book. It's called The 30 Names of Night.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me, Linda, and Mary for doing this whole virtual event. I know it's different, but it's very cool that I get to be here in Europe and then also with you all. And this is really cool for me just because, although I was born in New York City and the early part of my life, I grew up there. I spent my entire adolescence and part of like later childhood in Fairfield and really grew up there. And so I have, really deep roots in Fairfield. And so this is really cool for me because the Fairfield Public Library was a place that I spent a lot of time as a kid and, would sit and read like in the children's wing. And so I'm really excited to be here for the third time. And this book too is really, obviously my first book too is really near and dear to my heart, but this one especially was unique because, between my first book and my second book, I came out publicly as transgender. I transitioned, I changed my name. And so, now what's cool is that my first book, Map of Salt and Stars, has been reissued. So the paperback, like the third edition onward, I believe, of the paperback has my new name on it, has Zeyn on it. But it was cool when the second book came out, when 30 Names came out, to see, right from the get-go on the hardcover, to see my new name on that. And obviously this book deals with transition and talks about, a main character who is trans, who is non-binary. And so what I should start out by doing is just explaining a little bit for folks who haven't had the chance to start reading yet what the book is about. So basically the premise of the book is that it's about an unnamed narrator at the start of the novel, who at the start of all of his chapters, actually, not only is he unnamed, but he scribbles out his name. So you start out looking at this scribble, which I did all of the scribbles in the book by hand, actually. And actually there's a good story behind that we can talk about later if you want. But I basically decided that this narrator was going to start out the book and was going to spend much of the book unnamed because he's actually searching for a new name. That's at the start of the book, he's trying to figure out what he should call himself. And he is non-binary and transmasculine. He's also Syrian American and Muslim. And he's living in New York City, and he's basically the sole caretaker for his grandmother, who is fairly ill. And so he lives a kind of an isolated life. And part of that is because he's distanced himself from a lot of the people in his life because he is going through such a difficult period where he's trying to figure out whether he should come out, how he should come out, how he can even describe in language what it feels like to inhabit his body and his life. And so what happens is, as he's trying to figure this out, by training, he's an artist. So he is actually an artist with artist block is probably the better way to put that, because he hasn't painted anything in years since his mother passed away. And she was killed in a mysterious fire that was sort of never solved and was most likely a hate crime. And so as he's dealing with this sort of the way that his life is almost closing in on itself, he goes to the one place where he feels that he can paint, even though what he's painting is graffiti, is street art. He goes to this part of the Lower West Side in Manhattan, where there's a neighborhood that was once called Little Syria. And this is a real neighborhood. There's 3 buildings left of this neighborhood that used to be this very large, thriving enclave of immigrants from the Levant, so from what is now Syria, but also largely what is now Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan. It's mostly, it consisted of people from what is now Lebanon, let's say, but also Syria and other places. And so he goes to this neighborhood every night, partly because he's looking for his own history. He's looking for the history of his community and his own family. And he finds there the notebook of a Syrian-American bird artist named Layla Z, who's fictional, who mysteriously disappeared in the 40s. And so the book then at that point, you start to get these snippets of her notebook and so of her life and what it was like for her coming to America from Syria in the 1930s and into the 1940s and trying to make a career as an artist, as a nature artist, and as a woman who was an Arab at that time. And so the 2 stories at first seem like they're not related, but and I obviously won't spoil anything for you, but as the story goes on, you realize that these 2 characters very much need each other, that the history, like the past and one's history is sort of reaching out for the present, that we can't really envision a future for ourselves or build anything unless we know where we're coming from, unless we know how we got here. And that's a big theme in the story. And so I think ultimately, this is really, for me, was a story about needing to know and see yourself in your own history. And also about overcoming erasure and having an accurate narrative, overcoming having an inaccurate narrative, you could say, ascribed to you and replacing that with a more accurate one. So that's both as an Arab American person, it's as a transgender person, the many different kinds of erasure of the present, but also of history. So, a lot of this book is also about the fact that this bird artist was queer herself. And so as somebody, who was living in the 1930s, who was of color, who was an immigrant, what were the things that she faced in trying to figure out how to survive? Because, it is true that queer people and trans people are erased from history much of the time, but it's also true that there's a lot of history that couldn't be told for safety reasons, for survival reasons. So I think that a lot of the book also deals with that, with that tension in what can we say, what don't we say, what do we want to say, and also that we know that even if we may not be able to look at the historical archive and see immediately and clearly in the same language that we use now what certain lives were like, we can infer that that they were there, and I think a big part of this book was about the fact that queer people and trans people have always existed, and they were always a part of our communities, including the Arab American community. And so what does that mean? What does it mean to be excluded, but also what can it look like if we want to restore some of that history and try to imagine it with compassion and with empathy, and also not only acknowledging how difficult it must have been, but also acknowledging the joy that must have been there too in these people's lives. And so ultimately, part of the reason that this narrator scribbles out his name is because so much of the book does deal with erasures that happen when we don't necessarily have the power to push back against them. So if you don't have the power to, let's say, assert yourself in the historical archive, or you don't have the power to correct an inaccurate narrative that's being ascribed to you. What do you have power over? And in a concrete way, that manifests in this book as this character being aware of the fact that the reader wants a name. And so he knows that there's a name that is expected of him, his birth name. He knows that he doesn't have another one yet. And the only power he has in that moment, maybe, is to say, I'm not going to give you my birth name because it's not for you to know. And so in that way, his erasing his own name is a kind of resistance in that act of counter erasure, of saying, I may not have the power right now to know exactly all the language for my experience. I may not know what name I want to call myself. I may not have the power to tell you how to talk about me and how not to talk about me. But what I can do is I can take this away. And his silence can actually act as a kind of resistance. And so basically, for me, as I was writing this book while I was transitioning, one of the things that, looking back on it now that I can sort of see more clearly is that I was really writing about these two people searching for the same mysterious bird, but not just in terms of looking for things that, that some people may not believe exist, not being listened to, but also in terms of the fact that, in a way, the rare bird that this character, who eventually calls himself Nader, is searching for, he's really searching for the rare bird of himself, in a way, because a lot of the story is his grappling with the fact that to a lot of society, he's not supposed to exist. That society wants to label him in a certain way and wants him to sit very neatly inside of a box, whether that's due to transphobia or whether that's due to just erasure of non-binary people as well, because they want to clearly define, we want to know what binary gender you are, and he can't fit in either one of those categories. And also in terms of history, that, the history that's not supposed to exist, the history that's erased, that all of these things exist anyway, that this character exists anyway. And so also this bird that Layla Z and Nader's mother both saw before their disappearance/death, that he's searching for this rare, mysterious bird, even though everyone tells him it shouldn't exist. Because in a way, the same thing is being said about him and he exists anyway. And so I think that for me is really the heart of the story, that we need to be able to know our history in order to say to ourselves, I'm not just here sort of acting independently. I'm, as much as we might want to believe that, we are always affected by our ancestors. We're affected by where we came from and how we got here. And that's actually a beautiful thing, because that's what allows us to imagine where we can go from here and what we can build and what we can do and what we can be. And I think that, you need that imagination looking at the past as well as looking at the future. Because the past, I actually, it comes full circle, because I talked about this with Map of Salt and Stars as well, that, maps are drawn by people with power, that a map is a story told by people with power, and the map is supposed to tell one story, but it can also tell others. And I think in a similar way, you can look at history, and history can be told by people with power in order to look like it says just one thing, just one very clear thing. And it's very rarely like that. And for me too, when I was researching this book and going into many historical archives, I think for me, one big thing that stood out was that we need to, that it's to our benefit, I guess, to look at history from the eyes of the people who are most often left out of it. And, especially I think as a trans person myself, as a person of color, it gives me comfort. Also, my narrative, my story, that doesn't mean that I am not here now, that I didn't exist, that I won't leave behind some evidence that I was here, and the same is true of my ancestors and my elders. So I think, yeah, I think that's where maybe I'll leave off on that note.
Well, I wanted to
um,
jump in too with after I read it the
yeah,
first time, I started doing some research on Little Syria because I've been all over Manhattan and had no idea. And then to do the research and find that they found the cornerstone of one of the churches that had been torn down when they were going through the rubble of the World Trade Center. To know it was like a civilization was just erased almost. And the fact that some of them did move to Brooklyn, that there's still that thriving community in Brooklyn, but that they had started and then had really been erased from Lower Manhattan.
yeah, it's a really fascinating history. And there's the Washington Street Historical Society is one of the organizations that's really working to remember this history and to catalog it, and also to protect the 3 remaining sites. They've been trying for a long time actually to get like landmark designation for these sites. And I think that they succeeded with St. George's Church, which is this beautiful church in the middle of these. Oh no, it's actually on one side of the other 2 buildings. There's a community house as well, and there's a tenement on that same piece of Washington Street, on that same block. But the other 2 buildings, and the book mentions this as well, in sort of as part of a greater problem of gentrification, as its own sort of very sad way that history gets lost. That you wouldn't necessarily know, the history of these buildings when you look at them. And even St. George's Church is now, there's a pub on the inside of it the last time I was there. And it's pretty much been, the inside of it is like gutted. So I do think that, I think it's complicated, right? Because there's a narrative of, where do Arab Americans fit in? And there's the narrative that's commonly given that, that we're sort of somehow a recent phenomenon. And I think part of when I was writing this book, I was thinking about how that's also often the narrative for queer people and for transgender people in particular, that this is sort of somehow new. And obviously neither Arab Americans nor trans people are new at all, actually. And so I think that when I was telling this story, I was kind of connecting those things, and I was saying, well, I mean, there's so much, in a way, like we can think of the future as something that's sort of like rich beyond our imagining, but also the past can be that way, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. Personally, my dad came over from Puerto Rico, and he always told the story of when he was young, they lost their property. The United States used eminent domain to build a military base. So that was one of the low / defining parts of his childhood, knowing they had to move just because of that, and like having no say in the matter. And I feel like it's
Yeah.
something
And this was eminent domain too.
yeah.
Sorry, there's a
No,
delay, I
no.
think. I don't mean to interrupt
I
you.
just want to say again, if anyone has any questions, you can use the chat to ask them, and we'll pose them to Zeyn as we're going. In the
Yeah.
meantime, do we want
Would
to
you
talk?
like me to,
Oh,
oh,
did you
go
want to do
ahead,
a
go
reading?
ahead.
Did you want to do a
Yeah,
reading?
I was going to say, I'm happy to read just a little bit while maybe people like digest the information and come up with questions and things.
I think that'd be great.
Would that be, okay, great.
Mhm.
All right. So I think maybe I'll just read from the opening here. So for those of you who have the book, we're starting off with 1 and then the protagonist's name scribbled out. Tonight, 5 years to the day since I lost you. 48 white-throated sparrows fall from the sky. Tomorrow, the papers will count and photograph them, arrange them on black garbage bags, and speculate on the causes of the blight. But for now, here, on the roof of Teta's apartment building, the sheen of evening rain on the tar paper slicks the soles of my sneakers, and velvet arrows drop one by one from the autumn migration sweeping over Bourne Hill. The sparrows thud onto the houses around me. Old 3- and 4-story brownstones, generation homes with sculpted stoops, a handful recently bought from the families who have owned them for decades and gutted for resale. Nothing has stayed the way it was since you died, not even the way we grieve you. Downstairs in Teta's apartment, I've drawn the curtains, tucked Teta's glasses back into their drawer, so that even if she wakes, she won't look down on this street dashed with dying birds. 5 years ago, when your absence stitched her mouth shut for weeks, I hid your collection of feathers, hid the preserved shells of robin's eggs, hid the specimens of bone. Each egg was its own shade of blue. I slipped them into a shoebox under my bed. When you were alive, the warmth of each shell held the thrill of possibility. I first learned to mix paint by matching the smooth turquoise of a heron's egg, first aqua, then celadon, then cooling the warmth of cadmium yellow with phthalo blue. When you died, Teta quoted Attar, the self has passed away in the beloved. Tonight, the sparrow's feathers are brushstrokes on the dark. This evening is its own witness, the bird's throat stars on the canvas of the night. They clap into cars and crash through skylights, thunk into steel trash cans with the lids off, slice through the branches of boxed-in ginkgos. Gravity snaps shut their wings. The evening's fog smears the city to blinding. Migrating birds, you used to say, the city's light can kill. A sparrow's beak strikes my hand and gashes my palm. I clutch the wound, the meat of my thumb dark with my own blood. You taught me a long time ago to identify the species by the yellow patches around their eyes, their black whiskers, their white throats, and their ivory crowns. You were the one who taught me to imitate their calls. Sam, peebity, peebity, peebity. In your career as an ornithologist, you taught me 24 East Coast bird calls, things I thought you'd always be here to teach me. I reached down to scoop the sparrow from the rooftop with my bloodied hands. He weighs almost nothing. There is so much of you, and therefore of myself, that I will never know. Tomorrow, when the ghost of you enters my window with the smell of rain, I will tell you how, since you died, the birds have never left me. The sparrows are the most recent of a long chain of moments into which the birds, like you, have intruded. The red-tailed hawks perched on the fire escape above Sahadi's awning, or the female barred owl that alights on Borough Hall when I emerge from the subway. For all my prayers the night you died, the divine was nowhere to be found. The 48 white-throated sparrows that plummet from the sky are my only companions in grief tonight, the omen that keeps me from leaning out into the air. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. It's just beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah, clapping, silent clapping.
Thank you.
No chats have popped up. Do you want to talk a little bit about the use of birds almost as symbols for the divine, for the sacred? They're really through the whole book.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, when I first conceived of this story, I was thinking about how I could access, I guess, the search for the sacred that a lot of the characters, almost all of the characters are going through in this book. So even before I knew that Nether's mother was an ornithologist, I was imagining that well, I guess I should say it this way. It was important to me to talk about the different ways that we search for the divine or the sacred in our lives as well as in ourselves. And I think, you know, for example, one of the big through lines of the book is Layla's mother, actually, in the 30s, the 20s and the 30s, is also struggling with her own feeling that even though she's a fairly religious woman, she struggles to feel like God is present in her life. And partly that's because she's seen so much loss and so much trauma, and it's been so difficult for her being an immigrant and leaving her friends and extended family behind in the Bilad and coming to America and a number of other things that happen. But also, you know, Layla is searching in her own way for the divine, and also as she comes to terms with the fact that she is queer, that becomes a struggle for her. And also Nader, most sort of centrally in the book, because I mean, Nader is trans, and I think that a lot of us, a lot of trans people, struggle to feel like we can access that feeling of that our lives are sacred. And I think that's taken from us in a lot of ways. And so it was really important to me to, I suppose, to sort of provide a blueprint of that searching, maybe not the solution, but of the searching itself, for how can we get beyond language and get beyond, beyond language, among other things, to sort of access what that wordless experience of inhabiting a human body in time is actually like, and that there can be, you can find sacredness in that experience of being human, and I think that that's really the central search for Nader and for so many of the other characters, even the ones who are not trans. And so from there, I started to think of the role that birds often play in many cultures, including in Arab culture, in other cultures in Southwest Asia and North Africa, as symbols of the sacred. And that has a very long, complex history that I went into a lot in my research. And so I decided that, the symbol of searching for a bird fit very well with the story. And one of the other searches for a bird that I sort of used and referenced in the title is actually this sort of very, very long Sufi poem by Fariduddin Attar called The Conference of the Birds. Maybe some folks have heard of it. That is essentially this. The story is this. There are a group of many, many birds who are who decide that they are going to set out and find the Simurgh, who is this sort of mythical, you could sort of think of the bird as being sort of phoenix-like, but it's sort of much older than the idea of the phoenix. And they want to ask this bird, to find this bird and ask him to be their king. And so the birds set off on this quest, and many of them, one by one, they sort of decide that it's too difficult, or it's too, they have to give up too much. And so by the end, there's only 30 birds left, and they find the Simurgh, and they finally get to see this legendary bird, and they see a mirror image of themselves. And then you realize that in the Persian language, Simurgh actually means literally 30 birds, Simurgh. And so they realize that the Simurgh is just a reflection of themselves. And obviously, I can't pretend to understand all of the very deep spiritual themes in this work, but I think that what I was trying to get at in this book, in 30 Names of Night, was the search for the divine in the self, the search to see oneself as being a reflection in some way of one's creator, and that's a reality that trans people don't often get to feel, because we're told explicitly that we're not. And I wanted to make a piece of art in this book that would allow other trans people to access that feeling.
It's beautiful. Okay, someone asks, are you familiar with the new book, The Book Collectors, a band of Syrian rebels and the stories that carried them through a war, by Delphine Manu?
I'm not familiar with that book, but thanks for bringing it to my attention. I'll have to go look it up.
And the process for historical fiction, did something you found out in research surprise you? Did it change what story you tell? Do you do all the research and then write, or is the process more circular and spiraling?
That's a
That's
great
a lot of
question.
questions.
Yeah, no, it's great though. So basically, for me, it really depends on the book. The historical research for this book, I would say, I did do a lot of research beforehand, but I also did research throughout. I mean, I think for me, that tends to be pretty common, just because I feel that it's impossible to know what I'm going to need before I start writing. So I'll get what I think I need. I'll sort of make my notes, and I'll do my reading, and I'll do whatever else I feel that I need to do. And then as I'm going along and I'm drafting and I'm revising, I'll realize, I want to explore this aspect that I came across in a more full way, but I don't have all the information. And so then I'll go and I'll get that information. For this book, one of the first pieces of research I did was I went to see an exhibit actually on Little Syria that was put on by the Arab American National Museum and the New York City Department of Records. This was back in, I think this was 2017. Yeah, I think it was probably 2016 or 2017. So it was a few years ago. And they had a huge wealth of information. I have to say, You can go also to the New York City Department of Records website, and they still have, a website and a summary. Also, the Arab American Museum has a summary of this exhibit and some photographs and things like this. They had, there were a couple of things that surprised me and even made it into the book, to be honest. One of them was a recording of an loose Arabic translation of the song America the Beautiful, which was Amerika ya Hilwa, and which basically means a very similar thing, if not the same thing. Hilwa is a word that means sweet, but can also mean beautiful. And I remember listening to this recording that was made like I think in the 20s, and being like, what must life have been like for people that, that they would have wanted so much to belong and to assimilate, that they would have, made their own version of this song. But also what a metaphor, for this community to come here and realize, well, I don't know. I mean, I think one way you can look at it is some people would eventually realize, surely, as, later immigrants especially did, that assimilation to some degree is impossible, undesirable, not, maybe this shouldn't be the goal, because it strips away too much from one's identity, but also trying to find a way to make things their own, and the other thing that stuck out to me was when I was at the Arab American Museum as an artist in residence. I was there in 2019. I had the privilege of listening to their historical archives of oral histories. So I was listening to these oral history archives of Arab auto workers in Detroit over many years. And it was fascinating. And one of the reasons it was fascinating was because, not only would people sort of just tell you about their life, but you would run across just the way that people would tell these stories. And it's hard to describe. What I'm trying to get at is actually, in particular, there was one, I can say as an example, one oral history recording that I remember of someone who described themselves as a woman auto worker, and described what life was like for her working in these factories, where obviously she was working with almost exclusively men, and how she was treated, and how she sort of found a way to, sort of tenuous fitting in, or at least people would, give her a minimum amount of respect, which she didn't always get. And, I was listening to this person's voice and just thinking, like, do I recognize something in this? Like, the way that she was speaking, it reminded me of how other people in my life speak, particularly queer women. And I don't know if this person was queer, obviously. There's no way of knowing that. But it was just that moment where I had this idea where I was like, my God, what if, like maybe this person couldn't, she wasn't going to say this on this recording, and maybe she wasn't, maybe she wasn't queer, but like, what if she was? Or what if, even if she wasn't, there must have been someone. And I think that idea of there must have been someone was something that really stuck with me from all the way from the research process through the writing of this book, and became really central to this novel. That even if we don't know the exact histories of folks who are our elders or our ancestors, or in the history of our communities, they did exist, and that these amazing lives are a part of our history. And just because they're not always talked about doesn't mean that they're not there, doesn't mean that they're not precious, and that maybe they even provide a blueprint for how we can survive moving forward, and that we should celebrate that, and we should remember that, that we should try to prevent them from being erased, even if it means that we have to go back and use our imagining to try to imagine what things were like, because we don't have all the information.
That was part of what I found as I was doing the research on Little Syria. There were so many pictures and archives of families and of men sitting around smoking from their little water smoker, and someone on the street with a big giant teapot. It's universal. Family is universal. And what I felt through this book, the search for identity, the transition to find who you are, and it's never really over. Like we're all still every day kind of dealing with this and trying to find who we are and who we want to be. And I thought that was part of the beautiful part of, is it Nadir? Where he needs to come to terms with who he wants to be and how he wants to be as a male, especially in America.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the book was, was also that grappling with masculinity. And it's funny because I think that it's in the writing, obviously, it's in the text, but it's not something that I hadn't really thought about it as taking up a lot of space. And yet I have gotten a lot of people commenting on it. And I think that it takes up space partially because it is just such a fraught, maybe is the word, a fraught experience. I mean, in terms of the fact that, and maybe it's something that's easier for me to speak to it from my own experience, even because I think for the character too, though, like the character does have these moments where he's thinking about, the men that he has known. He's thinking about, the character's thinking about his father and his friends, and is trying to sort of take the aspects of masculinity that resonate with him and that he wants to embody and leave behind the violent, toxic masculinity that society tells him is sort of part of the prescribed definition of what masculinity or maleness is. And I think that is definitely, in terms of my own experience, my own transition. I mean, I think that's like for anybody who embodies masculinity in any way, whether you are a binary cis man or a binary trans man or a non-binary trans masculine person, which is how I identify, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that masculinity itself, unfortunately, there are a lot of aspects of masculinity that are fraught and difficult and have been, have been embodied in violent ways by people, masculine people that came before us, men that came before us, right? And so, but the case is that it's not just for trans people and trans masculine people to decide what kind of masculinity we're going to embody. It's for any masculine person at all, and that includes cis men. And so, when I did my NPR interview last week that just aired yesterday, we talked about that a little bit. And I think that the point that I made then is, is really important, that it's really more about what kind of person you want to be, and whether, no matter what your gender is, one can't really control how, whether one is, what sort of balance of masculine and feminine is in one's nature, right? Like that's not something that I have control over, but what I do have control over is being a good person and not being violent and not being harmful and not, let's say, trying to be aware of how much space I take up, trying to be aware of how I relate to women and to feminine people in general, that sort of thing. So I do think that the character is grappling with that a lot. And I think that by the end of the book, hopefully, the character and also the reader have a lot of examples of other kinds of masculinities in Nadir's friends plural, in other family members, in historical figures that he comes across. This is true in Map of Salt and Stars too. I try in my work to, I guess, to put alternative models of masculinity out into the world. I think it's important.
Absolutely. Does anyone else have any other questions?
I just have one question. And when you were talking about listening to oral histories and how lyrical and beautiful and poetic the story is, it makes me wonder about the audio version, which I would love to listen to. Have you heard it? Are you pleased with your narrators? If you've had a chance to hear it or approve them, or how did that come out?
Yeah, the audiobook is great. I definitely recommend it very highly. I had actually a really cool experience with the audiobook in that, and for those of you who were, if there's anybody here who happened to be at the launch at the Center for Fiction, you'll already know this, but basically the narrator, there's two narrators for the audiobook, one narrator for the character of Nadir and one for the character of Layla. And the voice actor who plays Nadir is himself a transmasculine person and Arab, and that was important to me. I wasn't sure at first that it would be possible, and it was, and I'm so thankful because he does such an amazing job on the audiobook. And he was present also at the launch where we actually did a staged reading of an adaptation that I made from the book. And so I got to like hear some of the passages dramatized. But it was amazing I think that was getting to work with another trans person and another trans person of color on not just the launch, but to have the audiobook as something that people can listen to and that I can hear his voice and be like, wow, like this is, I feel it's important in the book as well, this idea of sort of being in community together. And I think that it's really cool that even the audiobook itself is sort of like something that, that I did with other folks, including other trans folks together to make this amazing thing. So yeah, the audiobook is great. Highly recommend it.
Yeah, and as Mary said, your writing is so beautiful and so lyrical that to be able to listen to
Thank
it,
you.
especially someone reading it with the proper pronunciations. As I'm reading, I don't always know how to pronounce some of these words. So
Sure,
I
yeah.
find audiobooks have a value in that as well, like just to really get you into the whole culture of it.
Yeah, there is there's a fair amount of Arabic in the book. And you know what, I think every time that I'm writing and I choose to include any non-English language, but especially Arabic, I think about the fact that I trust my reader and that my readers are smart, and if they need to Google, they'll Google, or they'll figure it out from context. But I want to give that experience too, right? Like I want to let the reader know that I trust them enough to bring them into what life is like for this character, right? Without necessarily translating, and to say, you know what, like, I want to show this to you. I don't want to give a watered down version or a sort of a version through a translation. I want the person to come away feeling like they have been let in on an experience that's rather intimate. And I think especially this book is sort of I think about it as a close book. Not in the fact that it's close to me, but in the fact that the reader is close to the narrator. And that's not true of every project that I've written. I think both books are fairly close in that way, but other fiction that I've written, I don't always do that. And I think that it was important in this story because I wanted the reader to feel that they had really met this person and that they had been maybe even in this person's body with them, because I don't think that that's an experience that readers get a lot in fiction. I think that there's a lot of nonfiction out there, and there is more and more fiction by trans writers, I should say. And I'm so excited about that. There's a lot of amazing books. And in fact, the National Book Award just went to a trans writer, Kason Callender. But anyway, I really wanted to put that out there. I wanted to give an opportunity for readers who are not trans as well to come to this page and say, I want to know what it's like, and I don't want to get the sort of watered down version. I want to really understand. So I hope that this book will also do that. Will also be an opportunity for readers who are not trans to come and gain some understanding, and also for trans readers, especially those who maybe are early on and don't have the language, that they can come to this book and they can come to this character and feel understood.
One more question popped up. Your approach in writing fiction seems to encourage the reader to use their imagination to give voice to and have compassion for marginalized voices. Am I understanding that correctly? And what other ways might readers respond to your stories?
Yeah, I think that is, one thing that is important about my writing. I think that when I'm writing, my main goal is to speak directly to the people that I'm talking about, I guess you could say. So like, for example, when I was writing Map, I was really aiming to talk to other people who were in the Syrian diaspora, people who were themselves refugees, people who were themselves perhaps the children of refugees. I wanted to sort of offer something to people that I felt that I was in community with, in order to maybe ease the pain of what we were all sort of collectively going through. Some of us much more directly than others. I mean, obviously I'm not a refugee myself. And I think that with this book, I was mainly aiming to put down an accurate, not just accurate, but sort of an honest depiction of what it really feels like to inhabit a human body in, a particular place and time, and to also to be trans, to be non-binary, to have to sort of come to terms with the fact that no matter what you do, you may never be readable to society, that the world may never see you as you see yourself, and to somehow find a way to be okay with that. And I wanted to do that in a way that sort of could get beyond language, because in a way, language is sort of a barrier to that feeling of immediacy and immediate sort of embodiment. And I primarily did that for other trans readers, because I needed a book like this when I was younger. And I want this book to be there for, like, for example, for the kids that are coming up after me, but also for people that are older than me, right? Who maybe they read this book and they say, oh my God, like, this is me, Maybe they hadn't found themselves in a lot of the sort of mainstream definitions of what it means to be trans that are mostly written with cis people in mind, frankly. But maybe they can find themselves in this. And so that's my main goal. And I think that I aim to do that in a way that also leaves room for other people to come into the story and say, I'm not from this community, but maybe I can understand better. Or I've never had this experience, but maybe in a way I can understand something on an emotional level that I didn't before, that the language, that sort of reading about it in other ways, or in the news or in nonfiction or whatever, maybe I couldn't access, but they can access it from this more emotional approach. I think that's what good fiction hopefully does. I think it gives an opportunity for the reader, whoever they are, to have an experience that is primarily emotional, through presenting them with these images of this story, these scenes of the story. Ideally, you create an emotion in the reader that you are feeling yourself. I actually think of novels as sort of machines for reproducing emotion. How can I take an emotion that I'm feeling and reproduce that in a reader? And so ideally what you're doing is really going beyond language. And so it doesn't really matter in the end if the reader is, just like me or not. My lens is there, my experience and my emotions are there, but ultimately it's just about trying to make that connection.
And that's pretty much what my response was the first time I read it through. I stopped, I finished it, and I thought, okay, I'm gonna have to reread this a couple of times. There's so much happening. There was so much that I was responding to, as far as getting into the characters' heads. And even the reaction to the scribbled out name. At first I thought, what's happening? Because I was reading it as an arc. So I thought, is this something that's in the arc that is coming still? But then as I got into it and realized it, I thought it's also that character's way of taking back some control of, like, I'm not going to let you identify me. I'm going to find my own identity. But there's so many universal themes in this book of finding family and finding yourself, that really anyone can relate to it. It was a much more personal book, I thought, than Map of Salt and Stars, which almost read more like a fable. Well, half of it was kind of an adventure, like Arabian Night kind of fable, but this was much more personal, I thought.
Yeah, I think that my goal was for this book to feel more, not necessarily personal to me, and because there's really very little in this book that could be said to be autobiographical. Aside from it being about a trans person being a trans person from New York, but I wanted the reader to feel that sense of connection, and actually, if we want to talk about personal stuff, I almost forgot that I have that funny story about the scribbles. If anyone is interested, it is kind of a random story, but since I'm watching the chat and I see there's no other questions yet. So I had this idea for these scribbles when I was living in Italy a couple of summers ago. Last summer, 2 summers ago, I guess. Yeah, 2 summers ago. Time has no meaning in the pandemic. Anyway, and so I had this idea that, because I was struggling with this, like, can I leave this narrator unnamed for almost the entire book? there is a lot of history in the canon of, unnamed narrators or anonymous narrators, but it's still like, it felt like a risky choice. And I wanted it to be clear that there was like Layla, and then there was the main character in the contemporary timeline. So how did I keep these separate? And I had this idea like, oh my God, but what if I could scribble it out? And that way it would draw attention to its absence, right? And so I get all excited, as I often do when I have an idea, and I go and I grab the nearest piece of a paper with writing on it that I can find. And it happens to be this, what I think is a receipt. And I grab this receipt and I grab a Sharpie and I start scribbling things out. And this is a little known fact. Some of the scribbles, maybe all of the scribbles, or almost all of them, are actually from this scribbling out, from this receipt. Those are what's in the book, are PDFs basically or JPEGs or images of those scribbles. And I'm like all proud of myself, and I show this scribbled out receipt to my partner, and I go, look, I came up with the solution. And my partner goes, oh my God, that's the parking ticket I have to pay. So that was not my finest moment, but it was fine. We got it sorted out.
So for anyone that doesn't have a copy of the book yet, I'm just going to put this up here so you can see what Zeyn's talking about. So
the scribbles, yeah.
Yeah, the scribble. As I said, the first time I read it through, it took me a little while to even realize what the scribble was, as opposed to just a problem with the advanced reader copy. But the scribble's really...
Here's another example. And this is the arc still, but you can see there's actually, I don't know if there's spoilers on this page, but there's whole, sections of text that are scribbled out. And they're all scribbled out by hand. It's really my hand with a Sharpie on a piece of paper that probably should have been left alone, but it makes for a good story anyway.
Was the ticket paid eventually?
It was. Luckily, I did not scribble out the information that was needed to pay the parking ticket. So
it's great. All right, does anyone else have any questions or comments? No? I'm just going to take a moment then to say thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to Zeyn, really, for joining us tonight, for where you are. And congratulations on the publication of the book and finding a space to live safely in the middle of this pandemic, and for finding happiness. Really, we're so happy for you.
Thank you. It means a lot to be here, and thanks again for having me back. It's always really cool to come back to the Fairfield Library. So, and everybody for being with us.
And if and when this is all over and you can travel again, we're going to have you in just to sign some books, I think.
Yes, please.
Yes, absolutely. I would love that.
And we get to see your mom again.
Absolutely.
My mom is 2 for 2 with my book events, these virtual book events. She's been here, so
awesome.
Hi, Mom.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Zeyn, again. And
thank you all so much.
Just a reminder that Christmas and holidays are coming, and this is going to make a fabulous present for really anyone. That it's got mystery, it's got historical fiction, it's got that whole search for identity. It's a wonderful, beautiful book. So everyone,
it's even got a generations-long romance that I don't want to spoil, but it's one of my favorite things.
And the Fairfield University Bookstore, which was helping sponsor this. They have copies there. I checked this morning. Craig said they've got plenty of copies over there if you want to run over and get one.
Awesome. Yes, please enjoy the book. And thanks again for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Great to see you again.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good to see you too.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.